in this class this semester, I'm making three big predictions, right? First is that Trump will win in November. Second is that the United States will go to war against Iran. And the third big prediction is that the United States will lose this war, which will forever change the global order. Okay, yeah, so let's game theory this war between the United States and Iran, how it might play out. So the Americans, their entire military strategy, regime change, rests on three pillars, okay? These three pillars are propaganda, bombs, and U.S. bombs. And last thing that's most important is U.S. dollars. The idea here is that they're going to use U.S. dollars to buy out groups in Iran that might be opposed to the regime. This includes dissidents who have always been there. This includes ethnic minorities, like the Baluchs in Iran. This also includes insurgents in Iraq, so the Kurds. So there was a Kurdish incursion into Iran. Turkey provided some intelligence, and the Iranians were able to wipe out these Kurdish insurgents. But expect more of that, okay? So basically, America trying to print as much U.S. dollars as possible and bribe, both the security services as well as insurgents to undermine the regime as possible. So this is what I believe how the war will play out.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to the show. It's your host, Danny Haifong. As you can see, I am joined by Jiang Suiqin. He is the host of Predictive History Moment. And I know that we are just into 2026, and the Trump administration, the U.S. empire, has really lit a huge fuse in many different flashpoints around the world. Let's start with Iran. So even as the Trump administration has said that it has paused strikes, we now have lots of news coming out that this could indeed be a very brief pause. The Trump administration told Politico, Donald Trump did, it's time to look for new leadership in Iran. This comes as Israeli media, according to Jordanian media citing Israeli media, saying that a U.S. strike against Iran is still inevitable and that it could only be a matter of timing rather than a possibility, according to Israel's Channel 12. Now, Professor Jiang, what's so interesting is we have a situation where the United States got so close to striking Iran. Planes were actually in the air, according to many sources, and then suddenly there was a pause. It's not going to happen. Trump says that Iran is not going to execute people anymore. But I think the truth is a lot deeper than this. Talk about where you see this going in 2026. Is the Iran flashpoint for the United States empire going to be what triggers a major cataclysmic global world war that we have been talking about so much on the show with you and with others? Or is there something else going on?
Right, yeah. So let's talk about Iran, and let's look at the chain of events that led us to today. So for New Year's, Benjamin Netanyahu met with Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And then right afterwards, what happened was that currency speculators caused the Iranian rial to collapse. And so you have these merchants who legitimately went to protest the corruption, the mismanagement of the economy. But then very quickly, these protests start to spread like wildfire across Iran. And then the information landscape, social media became dominated by anti-Iranian posts saying that the regime was on the brink of collapse. The mullahs had fled to Moscow. All this is just misinformation. And then you saw some protesters who were clearly provocateurs. They started to kill police officers. And then Mike Pompeo, who used to be Trump's Secretary of State in his first term, he tweeted out that he wished a Happy New Year to these Iranian protesters. He believed that regime change was imminent, and he also wanted to greet those Mossad agents who were working alongside those protesters. So he basically let people know that this is in fact a Mossad CIA operation. And then you had these diplomat families, Russians, who were fleeing Israel and the Middle East. And then you had these military assets of the Americans start to evacuate the Middle East as well. So it seemed very likely that a military operation was imminent. But then what happened next was that the Iranians were able to jam the Starlink terminals. They basically shut off the internet. and then they were able to locate the Starlink terminals and thus able to locate all the Mossad assets working within Iran. And through that mechanism, they were really quickly able to step out the protests. So for years, Israel and the CIA were developing these assets in Iran for this color revolution. This is a classic color revolution playbook. The only thing that they weren't able to do was rob the security services to sort of disappear like they did in Nepal. And so according to the color revolution playbook, once you reach a critical mass of protesters, what you do is you follow up with airstrikes, right? And the airstrikes are meant to sap morale of the security services. They're meant to sway public opinion. They're meant to create this narrative that the regime is about to implode. The problem, though, of course, is that the Iranians were able to step out the protesters, and therefore the airstrikes were no longer relevant. And that's why Trump had to cancel the airstrikes, because it would have been an act of provocation without any significance whatsoever. And so that's what happened. But the reality is that if they've launched a color revolution playbook, it just means that they are committed to regime change. So I expect in the next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of misinformation in the social media sphere, okay, which includes false flags, right? So remember that during the Syrian civil war, there was this misinformation, this campaign that the Syrians had launched a chemical attack in Syria, which swayed public opinion and which justified American military assistance to the rebels, the insurgents in the civil war. So we can expect something similar to happen as well in Iran. These people are not very creative. What you saw happen in Libya and Syria is exactly what's going to happen in Iran as well. What they are missing is the fact that this government in Iran, it's much more resilient, much more resourceful, and much more determined than either the Libyan and the Syrian regimes. So I think that we're heading towards a period of massive tension in the Middle East. And as time becomes, and as the Americans and Israelis become much more desperate, you have false flag attacks, and you have more airstrikes. And the big question is whether or not Trump will use ground forces. Because if Iran were to close off the Strait of Hormuz, then Trump would have no choice but to send in ground forces. And that would basically initiate World War III, because it would draw in China, Russia into the conflict on the support on the side of Iran. And then America would go all in into Iran. So it's a very dire situation. I think, like, if you just read the signals, it seems that World War III is very likely. Maybe not this year, but definitely very soon, either next year or the year after.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems like there's a big connection between what we've been talking about, Professor John, which is the collapsing American empire, and this descent into a World War III scenario, which I think you're exactly right. Iran represents this in a huge way. There was a big article in the Washington Post today, actually, talking about how Trump was confronted with the limits of U.S. military power in making this decision. And what's so interesting is after he claimed help was on its way, what ended up happening was that he wasn't going to get, this article actually cites, he wasn't going to get an operation like Venezuela, which is what he supposedly really wants. He was actually going to get something a lot messier. This is according to a U.S. official who is briefed on the planning that was going on around the strikes. But what's also so interesting is that J.D. Vance, there is a lot of psyops going on too, Professor John. J.D. Vance said this. He said he supported strikes on Iran, according to these officials who were close to what the White House was doing. Vance reasoned that Trump had drawn a red line and had to enforce it. Now, I don't know if you remember, Professor Jiang, it wasn't too long ago that Vance, we were being told, was urging Trump to try diplomacy. So this is part of, I think, the psychological operation that's being done to us to confuse us. But what's the reality here? How much did Iran, in particular, its own, in terms of game theory, its own military capabilities play into this? You mentioned Starlink. That was a huge deal. And, I tend to think that when you have planes in the air kind of scouting out the situation and then they don't do anything, they knew something was going to happen that wasn't going to go too well for the U.S. empire. What's your take?
Right. So first of all, Trump is first and foremost concerned about optics, right? So he is a reality TV star. He spent most of his adult life in the media, either as a celebrity being reported on by tabloids, or himself being a reality TV star. He had a hit show called Apprentice on NBC for over a decade, and it was really the number one show on TV for the longest time. So he's really concerned about opinion, about creating optics that the America is invincible, and that's why for him Venezuela was such a great success, because Delta Force was able to go in, extract Maduro, and there were no casualties, and that just showed America and the world that America is the most powerful military in the world. But if you look at the recent past, a much more indicative example of American military power is Operation Prosperity Guardian. That's when the Houthis closed the Red Sea in protest of the genocide in Gaza, and America deployed this massive fleet to strike at the Houthis. And the Houthis at this point, remember, they are poor, so their navy consisted of sailboats and fishing vessels. And if you just saw the videos of Operation Prosperity Guardian, it is really impressive. These warships backed up by helicopters and fighter jets, and everyone thought that, wow, the Americans are going to go in and smack the Houthis. And then they tried this for months and months, and they got nowhere because the Houthis refused to give up. And the Americans aren't actually used to fighting a war against an adversary who refuses to give up. They're used to shock and awe. They're used to scaring people and intimidating people with the display of their military might. And the Americans refused to take casualties, so they didn't send in ground forces. And the Houthis were able to, I believe, even sink an American ship. So it was a disaster for the American military. And there was this huge debate among the American military as to what to do. If you actually watch these panels, they're all actually on YouTube. You'll hear these 4-star generals and admirals go on and say, we recognize the limitations of American power in the Red Sea. We're not willing to make sacrifices. We're not willing to accept casualties. We want a cheap and easy win. And so we need to reflect on how to improve. And then someone in the audience asks, well, what are you going to do? And the response has always been, well, we'll think about it, And then the next question is, what are you going to do that's going to be different? And the generals and admirals were like, nothing. Well, we're going to keep the course, okay? So that's the state of the American military. The American military is not in a position to win a full-scale war against an adversary that's willing to fight back. Okay, they definitely can't win a war against Russia. And we know that because of what's happening in Ukraine. They can't even win a war against the Houthis. So this war against Iran will be a disaster, and Trump sort of knows that. So he's trying to hold this off as much as possible. At the same time, because of the nature of empire, you're committed to fighting this war. And the reason why is that the way to control public opinion, the way to control the globe as an empire, is through intimidation. Right, through the fact that we can strike at you at any place, at any time. And they were able to do that with Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, shock and awe, that intimidated the entire world. But then in 2022, the Russians attacked Ukraine, and the Americans were not able to stop them. So now the aura of American invincibility and inability has dissipated, and America needs to reestablish this by taking on Iran and showing that America still has what it takes. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that geopolitically, Iran is the pivot point of the world. It always has been. And the great fear is that Russia, Iran, and China will link up together and create a trade pact that can negate American sea power, right? So basically, Russia, Iran, and China, through the BRICS, is able to trade within themselves. They're able to use their own currency called the unit. And China is able to build railways connecting Eurasia with Africa. And then basically the entire American Navy is negated. America is blocked out of this trading block. And the American economy collapses because the American economy is a Ponzi scheme. So for a variety of reasons, the Americans have absolutely no choice but going to Iran. If they let Iran as it is, then China and Russia control basically the entire world. And so America is stuck where it is. It can't win this war, but it has to fight this war anyway.
Mm. And how do you see them fighting this war? Because if we go by game theory, it would seem that there are many drawbacks to getting into a major confrontation with Iran, even minus a full-scale invasion that includes what the U.S. Political class always calls boots on the ground. The Telegraph had this piece, how Iran's military power made Trump think twice. And it shows a map of how it's even just its short-range missiles, which it has hundreds, if not thousands, of these short-range missiles, essentially have the ability to cover its periphery all, from all corners. And this includes valuable bases that the U.S. keeps in the region, Professor John. So how does this war actually look? And is it going to happen in 2026? We are only still in the early period of this year. And as of right now, the Trump administration, the Israelis, they're all saying, no, this isn't a permanent stop. This is just a temporary pause. It's a matter of when, not if.
Okay, yeah, so let's game theory this war between the United States and Iran, how it might play out. So the Americans, their entire military strategy, regime change, rests on three pillars, okay? These three pillars are propaganda, bombs, and US dollars, okay? So propaganda means that the Americans control the entire information landscape. They're able to create this narrative, and everyone buys into this narrative because the empire controls the medias of authority, okay, including the New York Times, CNN, BBC. It controls YouTube. It controls Facebook. So the Americans are able to inundate information space with propaganda. We saw this actually with the Ukraine war, where in the first few days, social media was absolutely convinced the Ukrainians would destroy the Russians. There's this meme called "It Goes to Kiev." I'm not sure if you remember that. But the idea was that there was this one airplane, one fighter jet in Kiev, knocking down 5 or 6 Russian MiGs. It was just complete nonsense, but everyone bought into it. And that just shows you the power of American propaganda. Okay, so that's propaganda, and we'll see this a lot. Where for this entire year, okay, we nothing but propaganda. You just have to shut off social media, because 99% of what you see on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube will just be complete nonsense, right? The media will be focused on how corrupt the regime is in Iran, how popular protests continue to spread throughout Iran, how the prince, the crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, he's this charismatic man who will restore Iran to its former glory. Okay? So we nothing but complete nonsense throughout social media for the next year. Okay, I guarantee you that's propaganda. Then bombs just means that America will use its aerial supremacy. It has aerial supremacy throughout the world for some quick strikes. Okay, very similar to Operation Midnight Hammer, when they hit a bunker or a military bunker, and it did nothing whatsoever. Okay, but through propaganda they will inflate it. They will show how the superiority of American air power. Okay, so that's bombs. And last thing that's most important is US dollars. The idea here is that they're going to use US dollars to buy out groups in Iran that might be opposed to the regime. This includes dissidents who have always been there. This includes ethnic minorities, like the Baluchs in Iran. This also includes insurgents in Iraq, so the Kurds. So there was a Kurdish incursion into Iran. Turkey provided some intelligence, and the Iranians were able to wipe out these Kurdish insurgents. But expect more of that, okay? So basically, America trying to print as much US dollars as possible and bribe, both the security services as well as insurgents to undermine the regime as possible. So this is what I believe how the war will play out over the next year. So the war is ongoing. It's already happening. It's a shadow war. We really don't see it, but this is part of America's color revolution playbook, okay? So that's the American side. Now, the thing about Iran is that it's not all like Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nepal, where the color revolution playbook was employed in a very successful manner. Okay, so there are three major advantages that Iran has. Okay, the first is faith. These people are Shia, and their leadership are clerics, and these clerics, and it's hard for Americans to imagine this, but these clerics who control the country, they can actually sit in a room and meditate for decades. Okay, I mean, like they're not corruptible. You can't just bribe them and they'll go away. These people have faith, and they're able to inspire millions of their followers. The Shia also are eschatological, meaning that they believe that they have a mission to save the world, and they believe that the Messiah, the 12th Imam, will come back, the Mahdi, and will defeat the Antichrist, which is America. Okay, so these people have faith. They're willing to die for what they believe in. And that's hard for Americans to fight, okay? That's one, faith. Second problem for America is terrain, where Iraq, Syria, Libya, they're deserts, man. So it makes a perfect place for airstrikes. Okay, there's nothing with aerial supremacy. You can destroy the opponent's military very quickly. Iran is a mountain. It's a mountain fortress. It's always been a mountain fortress, and so it'll be very hard for America to intimidate Iran militarily. Basically, the airstrikes won't do anything in Iran. So terrain is a huge problem. It's also a huge country. It's 3 times the size of Iraq, and America doesn't have the logistics capability to actually invade Iran. And if you talk to any American military experts, they'll tell you like we've never figured out how to actually land forces in Iran, and we supply them. Okay, so there's going to be tremendous dissent within the American military. They're going to oppose an Iranian invasion because they think it'll be the stupidest thing in the world, and they're right. It'll be suicidal. Okay, so terrain is very important. The third thing that's very important is just decentralization, meaning that in theory the Ayatollah Khamenei is the supreme leader, but really the power is in the hands of these local mullahs that are spread around Iran. So the idea of shock and awe is to decapitate the regime, right? So you aim for the head, and that's what worked in Iraq, where they were able to very quickly, in about 2 weeks' time, strike at Baghdad, strike down the leadership, and the entire country fell. Okay, you basically cut off the head of the snake. You can't do that in Iran because it's a decentralized regime where local mullahs have control, have religious authority. So even if you control 90% of the country, you still have the 10% that's going to resist you to the bitter end. And from Americans' perspective, that would be a nightmare situation, just like Vietnam. Okay, so let's summarize. Okay, so the Americans have 3 major advantages. They have bombs, propaganda, and U.S. dollars. But the problem is that it's negated by Iran's 3 major advantages, which is faith, terrain, and decentralization. And so from a game theory perspective, this war that America wants to fight against Iran, it's not winnable. It simply isn't.
Yeah, and the Trump administration, though, continues to, and Donald Trump himself continues to focus on this decapitation, on leadership, saying literally that now there needs to be new leadership, because what is being said right now, Professor Jiang, is that the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is blaming the U.S. and Israel for the violence and the riots that occurred in Iran. And you just outlined from Starlink, that's Elon Musk. How did that get into the hands of these rioters? That was jammed. And then, of course, you have the fact that you literally prominent Israeli media journalists, quote unquote, saying that they were arming, Israel was arming the rioters. You had Mike Pompeo saying that Mossad agents should be saluted alongside the rioters. All the evidence is there, Professor Jiang, but yet it seems like there's just this constant need to justify a coming strike. And so this strike is going to happen in 2026, no? And what do you make of these accusations and these claims now?
You know, it's this classic color revolution playbook where you control the information space, okay? And so they're talking to the domestic audience, right? So the Israelis are talking to their own people and saying, you know, we have this, you know, we're going to win against Iran, and so you know you have propaganda for your domestic audience and you have propaganda for everyone else, which is like we have nothing to do with this. But look, this is color revolution playbook. Everyone with a brain knows that they're following a script, that these protests, maybe they were organic to begin with, but their spread has been inorganic. And the violence against security services, you know, the killing of dozens of police officers, which has been confirmed, that's clearly agent provocateurs working on behalf of Mossad and the CIA.
Yeah, and it's just so clear now, Professor Jiang, what the playbook is, as you said. Where does Iran fit into this larger picture then? Because there is a situation that the United States is facing that even the media, the mainstream media, is talking about, which is the U.S. military cannot do everything at once. Talking about the hotspots around the globe mean heightened risk that any retaliation succeeds, referencing Iran, but really talking about the whole world and how the U.S. military is indeed everywhere, Professor Jiang. And It just so happens that one of the main reasons why a strike didn't occur was because the Israelis supposedly said, we don't have enough air defenses rebuilt from the 12-day war provided to us again. And there aren't aircraft carriers here to support a long-term strike because a lot of them have been moved to the Caribbean or remain in the Pacific. So where does Iran ultimately fit? Because last time I checked, the national security strategy, Professor John, said that the U.S. empire is supposed to be controlling the Western Hemisphere and moving out of this region. And yet here we are talking about Iran.
Right. So I think first and foremost, there's this misinterpretation of what the national security strategy says. Okay, I've read it. Nor does it say that America is going to retreat back into the Western Hemisphere and leave, Asia and Europe to other powers, okay, create what I call spheres of influence. Nor does it say that, okay? What the national security strategy says is, number one, that America will no longer abide by these liberal, multilateral organizations like the United Nations, which has hampered American power, okay? So America just thinks that these organizations that basically justify the American empire are useless, and now it'll just be might is right. We will act unilaterally. We will act what will be in our best national self-interest, okay? That's number one. Number two is that it states explicitly that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America. Okay, this is what's called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine. Okay, it states that very clearly. Number three is that it will strangle China economically. All right, so the idea is you can't fight China in Southeast Asia militarily. That'd be suicidal. You're fighting China on its home front. So what you do is you blockade China economically. Okay, so that means basically taking control of the Western Hemisphere and cutting off valuable resources to China, which includes oil, of course, but also includes lithium, copper, and silver, which are crucial for high tech. Okay, including solar panels, AI, EVs. Basically, you cannot have a high tech industry without these rare earth minerals and these other critical minerals. And most of these actually mineral supplies comes from the Western Hemisphere, okay? So that's number one. But number two is that actually the United States will contest China in Africa as well. China is gaining a foothold in Africa, mainly because China is actually building up the infrastructure of Africa, and Africans like that. But what the Americans say is that, no, we will not surrender Africa to China. We will challenge China in Africa. Number three is the idea that from an American perspective, if you're an ally, all your resources, all your manpower, all your wealth belongs to America. It implies that in national security strategy, which means that essentially Japan is a vassal state to America. Both South Korea and Japan are vassal states. It also means that all these like billions of dollars that Japan has in U.S. Treasury holdings, it actually belongs to America. Okay, it's not Japanese. It doesn't belong to Japanese people. It belongs to America. So the national security strategy outlines how to maintain the American empire and how the American empire needs to transition from one focus on soft power, on building consensus, on multilateral organizations, to one of hard power, of actually using its military power to project forward by strengthening China, maintaining control over supply lines, and the other thing that national security strategy says that's very important is it basically gives up on Europe. It's saying that Europe strategically is not valuable to Europe, to the United States. Why? Because number one, it's an aging population, so they don't have much manpower. It doesn't have any resources. It's a welfare state dependent on American military protection, and the Europeans are too focused on DEI, too focused on world politics, and so. The national security strategy calls for either the abandonment of Europe or the underminement of Western Europe in favoring the rise of right-wing regimes in Eastern Europe that will be much more amenable to American power, which include Poland, Hungary, Austria. Okay, so that's what the national security strategy says. And once we understand what the national security strategy says, then we understand what's going on in the world, why Trump is doing what he's doing in the Caribbean, why he's doing what he's doing in Iran. A lot of it is to maintain the American empire, and a lot of it is to strangle China economically, to basically blockade China. So, China is blockaded on its eastern front by the first island chain, and that's why it doesn't really have blue water navy. And if Iran were to fall, then China would be blockaded on its western front as well. Okay, so a lot of it is geared towards China. I'm not saying this is the primary reason, but I'm saying that China is a consideration. So this is a strategy. The problem is that it's schizophrenic and it's confusing, because why are you sending a third of your naval assets to the Caribbean to fight, to bomb fishing vessels and to kidnap Maduro, and at the same time you are calling for regime change in Iran? From a military perspective, it's insane what America is doing. And a lot of people didn't believe that Trump would actually strike Iran because the naval assets weren't in place yet. They had to get the ships from the Korean all the way back to the Middle East. And if you keep on doing this, you're just going to exhaust the military. The military just can't move back and forth on a whim. It takes months of planning. It's extremely expensive. You're these soldiers, these sailors need rest. Trump is just going to exhaust the American military. Trump is not a planner. Look at it this way, okay? He had the most successful TV show for the longest time, The Apprentice. Okay, so he's very good at creating TV ratings. But at the same time, every business he touched, whether it's casinos, whether it's restaurants, he bankrupted. Okay, so this is a guy who's concerned first and foremost about optics. Doesn't really care about fundamentals, the fundamentals of business, the fundamentals of military. And that's why I think in 2026 it's just gonna be exhausting. Where we know what he's trying to do, but it doesn't make any military sense. Strategically, militarily, geopolitically, it's just idiotic. Why are you pissing off the Europeans, who are your allies? Why are you threatening the Canadians, who are your allies? Why are you, saying I'm going to go regime change in Iran when you don't actually have the military capacity to do so, and your generals tell you we can't do so? Why are you kidnapping Maduro, which is a direct insult to the sovereignty of the South Americans? So none of this makes sense, okay? But again, the problem is that Trump is first and foremost concerned about optics, looking like a great conquering hero. So he's interested in cheap, easy wins, okay? Such as, Maduro. Greenland will be a cheap, easy win for him. Then Cuba will probably be a cheap, easy win for him. He's not interested in these long, protracted conflicts that might backfire on him. But what he's doing is really delaying the inevitable, right? Because eventually you're gonna have to go to war in Iran, and the further you spread yourself out, it's like what we'll call imperial overstretch, right? The weaker you're gonna be in this, final boss fight with Iran, which is gonna happen sooner or later. So what's happening in the world, it's just moronic.
Yeah, well, maybe we can game theory this imperial overstretch, because that's exactly what the Atlantic piece that I have here talks about. And, Professor Zhang, we talk about the U.S. military not being able to do everything in these hotspots. How does the entrance of a possible full-scale war with Iran now factor into this? How does it change this? Because it wasn't too long ago where we weren't really talking about, again, a full-scale war with Iran being imminent. And now there's a lot of momentum, a lot of pressure into doing so. But we have talked about the Venezuela situation here, the kidnapping operation, which hasn't led to full regime change and has angered Venezuelans. They are in the streets every single day showing how angry they are about that. There is a large military presence, naval presence in the Caribbean that is very expensive and doesn't really seem sustainable. And then, as you have pointed out, if isolating China and maybe to an extent Russia, but if we look at China, all of these flashpoints from Greenland to Venezuela to Iran, if the Trump administration only optically succeeds, from my underestimation, China isn't really interested in optics. They're interested in actually doing business and getting things done. Seems like these operations that so focus on optics could actually serve the opposite purpose, which is to isolate the U.S. more. What do you think? Is the U.S. going to become more isolated, the empire, in 2026 as it pursues this chaotic, this chaotic agenda?
So I think the best historical analogy for what's happening today is the Peloponnesian War. It's a book written by Thucydides, who is this Athenian general who was trying to analyze this 30-year war between Sparta and Athens that really destroyed the Athenian Empire. He goes on and lists the mistakes that the Athenian Empire made in order to doom itself. And it's the same mistakes that the Americans are making as well, okay? So after the Persian Wars, Athens came across as a savior of the Greek diaspora, okay, across the Aegean. And so it's very similar to how after World War II, the Europeans thanked America for saving Europe from fascism. But the fear among the Europeans is that the Americans would abandon Europe like they did after World War I. So they created NATO. And the idea of NATO was to ensure that America would always have a military presence in Europe and defend Europe against the Soviet Union. And you could argue that as part of this deal, they created something called the Bretton Woods agreement. Okay, and the idea of the Bretton Woods agreement is that the U.S. dollar would become the global reserve currency to facilitate global trade, and to ensure that Americans would not abuse this exorbitant privilege, the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold. Okay, so that was the agreement after World War II. Problem is, 1971, America was bankrupt. Okay, America had spent billions on funding this pointless war in Vietnam. America was funding the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was a great program for Americans, but which was also bankrupting America as well. America had spent billions on the space race as well, sending a man to the moon. So by 1971, America was bankrupt. So Nixon basically said, you know what, I know we promised to pay everyone back in gold in exchange for US dollars, but you know what, forget that. Where US dollar will not be pegged to anything. Okay, so too bad. Just imagine US dollars as a tax you pay in order to be free, okay? And after the Soviet Union fell, everyone had no choice but to buy into the system, right? And this created over-financialization in the US economy. It allowed the rich to get richer and the poor to remain poor. And then basically America became very lazy and shifted its manufacturing to China. And because of all this, we are in a situation where we are today, where basically America is living off rent it collects from the rest of the world. It basically colonizes the entire world. And the mechanism it's able to do this is, of course, through the US dollar. And this doesn't work fine until 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine and showed that he's willing to challenge American hegemony. But not only that, but the Americans used their financial system, they weaponized the financial system in order to sanction Russia. And the classic example, of course, is SWIFT. It basically knocked Russia off SWIFT and it sanctioned Russia, but it failed. And it showed that the U.S. financial system isn't as powerful as you imagine. The other thing that America did, though, which is really stupid, was it basically seized $200 billion in Russian assets. So this is money that the Russian central bank had stored in Europe and America, and basically America said, nope, you can't touch it anymore. Okay, and this caused massive panic around the world, because if you put your money into America, you do so because you think it's protected by law. And if America can just seize your money for any reason, then people are not willing to put their money into America anymore. So this caused the Japanese, the Chinese, basically everyone to start buying more gold and in exchange their U.S. treasuries for gold. So basically another way of saying this is that America is this corrupt empire that insists on collecting rent from everyone. People are sick of paying this extortion, and they're rebelling against this. And so America is using force. Okay, and this is the same thing that the Athenians did back in the Peloponnesian War, and it turned these allies into vassal states, and eventually into enemies as well. And that's what we're seeing happening in Europe today, where these former vassal states have come to see that America is actually a real threat to their peace and prosperity, not Russia. But the other thing that's really interesting about all this, and it's really interesting, okay, is that while this is happening, while America is fighting while the Athenians are fighting these stupid wars overseas, the Athenians also engage in a civil war, okay? And the reason why is you have this massive oligarchy that comes into being due to all the corruption, and this oligarchy they are fighting amongst themselves for status. And we're actually seeing the same situation in America, where if you think about it, what's happening in Washington is actually a civil war between the deep state establishment, that's financial, right, which is Wall Street, and they came to power through the Clinton or Obama years. Now what Trump represents is the sort of like the new money, it's Silicon Valley, AI, surveillance state elite, okay, as embodying the people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, right, Sam Altman, Palantir, okay. So that's the conflict that's happening, And I think that a lot of this domestic conflict in America is driven by this deeper divide within the oligarchy. So this pattern we've seen before, okay? And it leads ultimately what? It leads ultimately to one, revolution in Athens. It leads to two, the entire world unifying against Athens. And three, it ultimately leads to the defeat of Athens. So I think a similar pattern will play out today, where there's a civil war or revolution in America, where the entire world unifies against America because they see America as the greatest threat to world peace. Number three is that this will lead ultimately to the demise of the American empire.
Yeah. I mean, we already have two flashpoints in 2026 that have already exploded in many ways. We have Venezuela and then Iran. And Iran is not done. Neither is Venezuela, which, from my estimation, Professor Jiang, the Trump administration essentially conducted a kidnapping operation, left the same government in power, and has now millions upon millions of people who support the current government in Venezuela very angry that their leader was taken from them. And in a context of a regional situation, which I've said this on the show, Professor John, the regional situation in Latin America and South America was not necessarily unfavorable to the United States before this. And I know that you have opinions on where that's going to go. So in terms of the future of the American empire, this is a major focus now between Iran and Venezuela. How do these two contexts then, kind of build the future of the American empire, or lay the foundations for the future of the American empire in 2026?
Okay, well, let's give Trump the benefit of the doubt, okay? And just say, like, there's actually a strategy here. And like, the end game, of course, is Iran, okay? America has to go invade Iran at some point. Now, if you invade Iran, there's a huge problem because Iran's going to cut off the Strait of Hormuz, and it's going to collapse the East Asian economies of South Korea, Japan, China. So China depends on 50% of its oil imports from the Middle East. So if there's a war going on, and this war could last for years and years, right? How do you compensate for the fact that these Southeast Asian economies, their economy is going to collapse, and they'll be dragged into the war as well? Well, okay, you can use Venezuela and North America, United States, Canada, to compensate for the loss of oil in the Middle East, right? So that's why you need to secure Venezuela, because you're anticipating this massive conflict in the Middle East. And so you need to modernize the Venezuelan oil industry in order to ensure that these East Asian economies don't implode and they're not dragged into the war, especially Japan and China and South Korea. So that's the strategy, okay? The problem with this is that you assume that the people of Venezuela are just going to sit back and let you steal their oil and resources and let them allow for Trump to impose a government, a regime that will only obey the Americans. You know, some Americans have a long memory of much despised Yankee imperialism, right? Like, you know, tens of thousands of people were killed by these military juntas controlled by the CIA, right? So Chile is a classic example where the democratically elected government led by Allende was overthrown by General Pinochet, who was backed by Kissinger and the CIA. So some Americans do not like American interference. So what this is going to do, even though it may make long-term strategic sense, it's going to piss off the South American people. It's going to rally the Venezuelan people. You know, eventually in Venezuela, in a few months' time, you're going to have a general election. This general election will be heavily contested, and America will be forced to send boots on the ground in order to maintain stability in Caracas. And then this will initiate a guerrilla warfare. So I understand, like, geopolitically, it does make sense what's happening in Venezuela, right? But the way that it's being handled is that eventually you have mission creep, and eventually you'll lead to a situation like Vietnam, and it's going to exhaust the American empire. So another thing saying this is in the short term, in a 2-year time frame, all this makes sense, and Americans will feel that, you know, Trump has control, and Trump is like this great conquering hero who will make America great again. In the long term, America is going to suffer tremendous blowback, not only in Venezuela, but throughout the Caribbean and throughout Latin and South America. So it's really the end of empire. Listen, the Americans could have done this at any point, okay? In fact, even like in one day, America could just go and topple every regime in South America. They had that military capacity. You don't do that because it's retarded, because it's suicidal, because you just piss off people. You're pissing off hundreds of millions of people. You're unifying them. You're giving them a reason to fight against you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you said there's a long history, Professor Chung, of this kind of behavior pissing off people in South America, Latin America, the Caribbean. Now, the Trump administration, the United States, they're not ones to hide, and I think this is a big problem for the American empire. They're not ones to hide how exactly they want to do things. And we've heard repeatedly from the Trump administration with regard to Iran, for example, and now Venezuela too, that they want quick, decisive blows. So they want to kind of have their cake and eat it too. How do you see this playing out now in the rest of 2026? Because if the Trump administration is going to try to move in with overwhelming force or sneak attacks or kidnapping operations, coups, this sort of thing, those have a high risk of not succeeding, as we have now seen twice already in the first month of 2026. What does this do then or how does this portend for the rest of even just this year, given that the Trump administration, they want quick, decisive blows? Sounds like they're going to try to land more than a few in the upcoming weeks and months to come.
Right. So that's exactly Trump's mentality, where he wants quick victories in order to create the optic that he's Julius Caesar, that he's just great conquering hero who will restore the American empire to its greatness. And quite honestly, most Americans actually support his imperial ambitions. I mean, that's just reality on the ground. Polls may say something different, but in their hearts, most Americans aspire to an imperial greatness. It's just human nature. So the reality, though, is that Iran's not going to fall. I mean, yes, it looks unstable. It's been economically depressed because of American sanctions for decades. But the mullahs are much more resilient, much more resourceful, much more creative than Americans give them credit for. So Iran's not going to fall. So what's going to happen is that Trump's going to get frustrated with the situation in Iran and shift his focus elsewhere, which includes Greenland, right? Greenland isn't quick, easy victory because there's actually nothing the Europeans can do about this. If if Trump just says, "Listen, I'm going to annex Greenland," no one can stop him. The Germans and the French and the Swedes and the Norwegians are like, we will militarily defend Greenland. So what do? Well, Germany sent 15 soldiers to Greenland. The French sent 13 soldiers to Greenland. Guess what? There's already 150 American troops in Greenland already. So the idea that the Europeans can actually resist this American annexation of Greenland is just retarded, okay? So that's a quick victory. Another quick victory for Trump would be Canada, okay? So the Canadian housing market has collapsed. There's going to be massive layoffs this year. And you'll have certain areas, like Alberta is the most obvious example, that's going to vote to succeed from Canada. And then maybe 20% of Albertans who vote to actually join the United States, okay? But Trump doesn't care. For him, it's like 100%, right? 20% equals 100% in his worldview. And he's going to threaten Canada and say, so, like, you either give us Alberta or we're going to come and invade you. And this is going to create a lot of TV drama, which is what Trump thrives on, okay? So that's also another quick, easy victory for Trump, Alberta, okay? And then another quick, easy victory is Cuba. Because what's happening is that Cuba's energy lifeline is Venezuela. Without Venezuela, basically Cuba goes dark. It cannot have electricity. Okay, so Cuba will also be another quick, easy victory. Then I think these are the three easiest right now, and then eventually you'll build up, because the problem with these quick, easy victories is it creates hubris. It creates it makes you self-delusional and believe that you're invincible. Okay, but I think that Iran will be much more resilient than Trump believes, and he'll get frustrated and move on somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, look, when it comes to the European or North America theater, I think the United States Trump administration can indeed hand wring and kind of strangle these countries politically, not even having to do much other than bully until they accept what their status has been for a long time, which is their vassals. They have to obey their master. The problem with Cuba is that Cuba, they went through a special period already. They lost their biggest supplier, their biggest economic lifeline in the past before when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they survived. And the U.S. couldn't even actually wage any successful color revolution campaign or a military campaign or a mixture of the two in that time. So the Trump administration will have his hands full in Cuba, I believe, too, if he believes that's an easy victory, because people in Cuba are fierce. They love their freedom.
I agree with your assessment, but Trump does not.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's exactly why I'm bringing this up. It's like, you think that's easy, but it might actually be a lot harder, despite just being 90 miles away from Florida. But Professor John, now let's get to Russia, because we haven't talked a lot about this. But Russia did launch its second Orushnik. The conflict in Ukraine is still happening, and you have said that this is kind of the entrance. 2022 February was the entrance of the world into the Third World War scenario that's now ongoing. Where do you see this conflict now taking the U.S. empire, and really just if we look at the whole, if we want to say a game theory board, because it's still happening. We know the trajectory of it. We know Russian victory is really where it's going, and even the West is having a hard time denying that these days. But it certainly has a huge role to play in shaping all these other flashpoints and theaters of conflict that the empire is looking at. So where do you see this going in 2026 and influencing the larger geopolitical map here?
Yeah, so I think the biggest story in 2026 will be the conflict between Russia and the United States in the oceans. So, as everyone knows, the United States for these past couple of months have been engaging in piracy. It embargoed Venezuela. So if you're an oil tanker, part of the shadow fleet that goes into Venezuela, the Americans reserve the right to board you, and they actually commandeered a couple of ships and basically stole tens of millions of dollars of oil in these ships. Now, what's interesting is the story about Bella One. Bella One is a ship that's part of the shadow fleet, and the American Coast Guard tried to board the ship, and Bella One just ran away. And then Bella One raised the Russian flag, meaning that it's now part of the Russian fleet. And there was this massive standoff, actually, for a few days between the American Navy and the Russian Navy, which came in to protect Bella One. But eventually, I think there's a phone call between Trump and Putin, and the Americans were allowed to board Bella One, commandeered it, and seize its cargo. But what's amazing, what's surprising is that this tanker was willing to resist the American Navy, and this is shocking. Okay, so I think what's going to happen in 2026 is you'll see more of these incidents, because what the Russians understand is, okay, listen. This war in Ukraine, it's much more than a land battle. Basically, it's a war for global trade access. And for the longest time, the Americans were able to control the oceans uncontested. And that's a source of American power, okay? So we need to be able to challenge America in the oceans. Otherwise, America can strangle the economies of everyone, including Russia, including China. So right now, there's about 1,000 ships in the Russian shadow fleet, that evade sanctions. And I would not be surprised if this shadow fleet became the new blue water navy of Russia. And I believe that the Chinese will finance this, because China, of course, is very concerned about American piracy in the oceans. And so there's no way that Russia can defeat America in the oceans. The American Navy is still the greatest navy in the world. But the problem for the American Navy is it cannot actually replenish its ships. Okay, so every ship that America builds, China can build 250. So America basically has lost its manufacturing capacity, its shipbuilding capacity. So if the American Navy is occupied in the oceans, fighting against this Russian shadow fleet / blue water navy, then eventually over time, the American Navy is going to overstretch itself. And this is going to free up space for other players like the Chinese and the Japanese. Okay, so I think that's a big story of 2026. This war in the oceans between Russia and America.
Yeah, I mean there are drills ongoing. Actually, I believe South Africa, China, Russia, Iran. are all participating in, with rumors that Iran was told to tamp down because Trump has now tariffs on anybody who's doing any business with Iran, 25%, on countries doing business with Iran. But this is coordination that is happening in the world. And, given that it's interesting that we talk about the Ukraine conflict is now settled, you've mentioned Odessa in the past. Do you see 2026 as the time where Russia is undergoing with the Oreshnik strike and the ongoing aerial campaign on Kiev and surrounding areas? It's turning the lights out to a large degree all over the country, and Odessa happens to be one of the main targets of this campaign. Do you see Russia in the next year really solidifying its pathway toward taking this? And then what does that lead to? Because Europe is rapidly trying to keep this war going. The U.S. is still tepidly, or at least while rhetorically changing, still has a pretty big skin in the game, especially intelligence-wise. We didn't even talk about the attempted assassination of Putin. There's a lot of elements here, Professor Jiang, and how do they play into where this goes over the next year?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to mention, of course, is the attempted assassination of Vladimir Putin. And, right afterwards, Putin said, I've had it with you guys. Clearly, you're not serious about peace. We will settle this on the battlefield, okay? So there's this national commitment now to winning the war in Ukraine on the battlefield, and no more, peace negotiations, because it's just a waste of time. It'll go nowhere, and the Europeans and Ukrainians will never abide by any agreement anyway. Okay, so this war will be won on the battlefield. Now, Russia and Putin have a major advantage, and the major advantage is they have strategic initiative, meaning that they're able to control the tempo of the battle. Okay, and what I mean by that is, look, the reality is that the Ukrainian army has collapsed. They are recruiting men. They're not really recruiting, they're kidnapping men off the streets and forcing them to fight on the front lines of Donbass without any real training, without any hope. And so you have these massive desertions among the Ukrainian military, like hundreds of thousands have deserted, run away already. Meanwhile, you have millions of Ukrainians who have fled overseas and they're never coming back. Okay, so not only has the Ukrainian military collapsed, but really the nation state of Ukraine is no longer viable. Okay, so Ukraine is done. If Putin said, let's go straight to Kiev, this war can be won within the next year. All right, so that's a battlefield situation. The problem is that even if you do win this war in Ukraine, you still have to deal with the Europeans at some point. You still have to deal with the Americans at some point. So from Putin's perspective, you're actually better off delaying this war, slowing down the tempo, and drawing in the Europeans. Okay? You give time for the Europeans to militarize, to send in volunteers to Ukraine, and they will, because it's so cost fallacy, because you're idiots. And so even though, Putin can go straight to Odessa, can go straight to Kiev, he really wants to delay this war as much as possible and create this war of attrition in Ukraine. The reality is that in Ukraine, the Russians have battlefield dominance, meaning that they control the skies with their drones. Their artillery allows them to control the front lines, and their soldiers have high morale, are pretty enthusiastic, and are very energetic. And the Europeans are completely confused. The British, there's a rumor that the British are about to raise the retirement age of soldiers from 55 to 65, meaning that in the future, 65-year-olds will be required to fight in a war. So the Europeans are just completely confused. They have no strategy, and they will just react to Putin's initiative.
Yeah. Well, Professor Jiang, when it comes to what's going on in Ukraine, and when it comes to this assassination attempt on Putin, we've had the Russian side say that, as you summarized, that they're changing their negotiating position, so a little more diplomatic than "we no longer trust you." But I think the message is very clear. Now, the Trump administration itself is doing its best to try to ignore what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. The most he'll ever say, that especially Donald Trump himself, is disappointed in Putin. Zelensky is this and that, a fool, but not much, because there's another theater. The White House posted this about the whole Greenland situation. There's a lot of focus on these low-hanging fruit, as we have discussed. And this is how the White House frames it, the Trump administration. After centuries, it is time for Denmark to give back. World peace is at stake. China and Russia want Greenland. There's not a thing Denmark can do about it. The United States of America is immediately open to a negotiation with Denmark and any of these countries. And of course, I'm not going to read the big Truth Social post here, but essentially it is a call, and Denmark has sent some troops now. France and Italy and all the European countries in NATO are kind of freaking out because they have no idea how to respond to the U.S. essentially bullying one of its own in order to acquire one of its territories, which, to be honest, was the territory acquired by a different kind of imperial, era. So talk about this shift. We see Russia in control in Ukraine, and then suddenly you have Greenland and the White House talking about Russia and China regarding this. Russia and China are being talked about regarding the naval blockade. There's a lot of Russia and China on the mind here. What's the real ploy? What's the reality of the situation?
Okay, so you talk to geopolitical analysts, okay, they will say that Greenland is extremely strategic for the Americans. Okay, the most important reason is something called the Arctic Passage, where now, because of global warming, because of shift in climate, the Chinese are now able to access the Arctic with their ships. So before they had to go for the Strait of Malacca going south in order to access the European market. Now they're able to follow the Russian coastline and access the European market through that way. Okay, so the Arctic Passage, the Chinese call this the Polar Silk Road. So the Arctic has become a very important geopolitical frontier. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that Greenland has tremendous resources. So it has lots of oil off its shores. It has lots of rare earths. Number three is that it's virgin territory. So there's talk of these AI companies going to Greenland and set up these data centers in Greenland because apparently the electricity there is a lot cheaper. The geothermal energy is a lot cheaper than elsewhere, and plus because of the temperature, you don't have to worry so much about cooling. Okay, so there are lots and lots of good reasons why you want to take Greenland. I think for Trump, again, it's pure optics. Where you just look at a map, okay, and you're trying to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, right? The Monroe Doctrine. Greenland is important because you just look at a map, okay? Greenland is the edge of the Western Hemisphere. So once you take Greenland, you have Greenland up here, you have Alaska over here, Canada is in between, right? So now, just like mentally speaking, just look at a map, Canada belongs to America. And this is just in terms of like optics, right? Perception, which is really the only thing that Trump cares about. Greenland is important. It just looks good on a map. For Trump, he wants to be able to have this map and post it everywhere, and the Canadians will freak out because the Canadians will be like, "Where next?" Okay, so Trump wants Greenland. He's going to get Greenland. There's nothing the Europeans can do about it. It's that simple.
Yeah, now let's talk about then, what's the role of China here? Because there's been recent data, Professor Jiang, that Zhejiang University is now the top university in the world. We know the U.S. is really obsessed with this AI push because a lot of these oligarchs in control of the AI industry are so hugely influential in politics. But nonetheless, there is this huge push by the United States to try to stifle China's technological progress, which arguably has dwarfed the U.S. in many areas already. And of course, all of these geopolitical flashpoints, the U.S. so-called strategists, the neocons, the warmongers, they're all talking about China with regard to it, whether it's the primary reason or not. The fact of the matter is that if it's not one, it's 1A. So how does China factor into this next year? Because there is I think a lot of attempts by the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, to make it look like actually now he's not so belligerent towards China, but everything that his administration is doing is in effect targeting China.
Yeah, so I think the biggest news story of 2026 will be April when Trump visits China. Okay, and I mean, like, I can go into the larger, geopolitical relationship between China and the United States, and it's very complicated. Okay, but I just want to focus on Trump and how he thinks. Trump, he's a mafia boss, right? And so what mafia bosses do is they like to extort weaker people. So basically what Trump wants to say to China is, listen, we control Venezuela. We can threaten Iran. We control Greenland. We control Canada. You guys need resources from the Western Hemisphere, but you also need trade access. And we control the oceans as well, okay? So you either pay up or, we'll blockade you and strangle your economy, okay? And so what does Trump want from China? Listen, I think that geopolitical analysts give maybe the United States and Trump too much credit, okay? The United States has become a mafia empire, and Trump is just a mafia boss. So what they want is money, okay? And so the idea is the Chinese have the highest household savings rate in the world, about 40%, okay? That's a lot of money. And so basically, it's very simple. Trump is saying to China, we want that money, okay? We want Chinese to buy US dollars. It's that simple, man, okay? And there are different ways you can do this, okay? So let's go over 3 ways, okay? The first is buy houses. So the average Chinese consumer is allowed to buy property in the Anglo-American Empire, which includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United States, okay? That's number 1. Number 2 is study overseas, right? So Trump has talked about doubling the number of Chinese students from 300,000 to 600,000. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is called stable coins. Okay, and stable coins are basically this digital currency that you can purchase from Apple or Google, but it's backed by U.S. Treasuries. And so it's a workaround against capital controls in China, okay? So that's what Trump wants. And you'll hear a lot about grand geopolitical strategy and, a new world order and all that, but that's just nonsense. At the end of the day, it's just a business transaction. Trump is a mafia boss, and he's extorting China. It's that simple.
But the problem may be, and you've talked about this, Professor Jiang, that trying to extort a country that is, has these advantages, including a population with a lot of money in its pocket, but also a country that, as I said before, is now moving in this advanced direction, has these top-level universities, has top-level research institutions, has top-level kind of technological advances. It's going to be hard to convince Chinese people that they should blow their money on a market that's extremely exorbitantly, completely artificially propped up by a massive debt bubble, which is very costly in and of itself, leading to a lot of Chinese people actually to leave the West, especially the United States. They're going back to China because they'd rather spend less on what is affordable in China, and then invest, of course, in property in China as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. But the problem, I also think, too, Professor John, where do the neocons then play into this? Because I agree with you. I think Donald Trump sees geopolitics and even war as a major business, not just a $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. He wants to see. He wants to clean up the contractors and make sure they are making as much money as possible, as efficiently as possible. But I agree. I think he sees everything as a business transaction where the U.S. gets richer and richer and richer. But the neocons, they care about getting richer, their donors getting richer and richer and richer, but they really like to destroy things. And destroying things makes it really difficult to make transactions. So I think this is a big problem, isn't it?
Well, no, there's a solution to this. It's called Japan, right? So a month ago, Prime Minister Takeyachi, the new Prime Minister of Japan, she said something very controversial in China. She said that Taiwan is a vital security interest of Japan. So what does she mean by that? What she means by that is that Japan is a resource-poor country. So it depends on trade in order to fuel its manufacturing economy, primarily oil from the Middle East. And so why Taiwan is important is that if Taiwan were to be controlled by China, okay, then at some point China could choose to embargo Japan. And if Japan would be embargoed, then Japan would starve to death, okay? So that's what she meant by that. Now, it's controversial. I mean, it's a true statement, and geopolitically it makes sense, but it's controversial because for the longest time, there was an agreement among all major nations in Southeast Asia, including the United States, including South Korea, Japan, China, that you do not discuss the Taiwan issue, okay? Taiwan is an integral part of China. We accept that. And Taiwan is not allowed independence. If you just maintain the status quo, there are no issues. And so when she said that, hey, Taiwan is a vital security interest, and we, the Japanese, will defend Taiwan if there is ever an invasion of Taiwan, then that's basically a declaration of war. right? And so what we're going to see in 2026 is a drastic collapse of China-Japanese relationship, of the China-Japanese relationship, and it's placed in the neocons because the neocons actually work for the military-industrial complex, right? So now the Japanese are going to remilitarize, and they're going to spend billions of dollars on new weapon systems from the Americans, and Japan will be the neocon champion in East Asia.
And to what effect, though? Because obviously, what we're talking about here then is U.S.-China competition, rivalry, and even the descent into war via a vassal like Japan. How does this end up developing then in 2026 when you mentioned China's potential China trip by the Trump administration, by Donald Trump himself? There's a lot of time until then, Professor Zhang, and we've had Donald Trump having had to cancel trips in the past because of geopolitical tensions. With all these flashpoints going on and the potential for major disaster, does this meeting happen, do you think, or is there a chance that it doesn't happen because of whether it's angering China or just being caught up somewhere else and also angering China in the process? What's your take on this?
Well, I'm surprised this meeting took so long. Trump said when he was inaugurated that he wanted to visit China within the first 100 days. So I'm really surprised that they had to wait this long to visit China. From a Trump perspective, it's really important to resolve this relationship with China, okay? And we've seen Trump, even though he's been belligerent to many people, he's been actually calm and diplomatic when it comes to China. He keeps on emphasizing the fact that he's good friends with President Xi. President Xi met his family, his Jared Kushner's and Ivanka Trump's children are they take Mandarin class and they recited Tang poetry to President Xi when he visited them in New York. Okay, so Trump keeps on emphasizing his close relationship with President Xi. So I'm really surprised this meeting took so long. And I think it took so long because Trump needs to put certain pieces into place. The reality is that China is an export-oriented economy, which means that it depends on trade access. It depends on markets. And if the United States is closing off these markets, it's closing off this trade access, then China needs to respond both in the short term and in the long term, okay? Long term, you have to destroy American hegemony, okay? And that means working with the Russians. But short term, you have to play ball because America has their new option is just to cut off all trade access to the Chinese because remember, America controls the first island chain. And if you control the first island chain, then you can cut off all trade, Chinese trade. You can close off the Strait of Malacca. So China in the short term needs to come to an arrangement with America. That's the dilemma that China finds itself in. Yes, in the long term, China's going to work with Russia. It's going to finance Russia's Blue Water Navy. It's going to support Iran. Yes, I understand long term, but in the short term, I'm saying within the next 5 years, you have a huge problem in your hands, which is trade access and trade markets. And you have to resolve that issue or your economy is going to collapse.
Yeah, no, indeed. And while Donald Trump's words cannot be necessarily trusted for anything, given that, as you called him, a mafia bosses especially publicly like to talk out of various forks of the tongue. But Donald Trump did say this as Canada was meeting Professor Zhang with China, Mr. Carney, the prime minister. It's basically said he's opening up to China. He wants to have a very solid relationship. Many in the Western mainstream media, U.S. mainstream media, have seen this as a potential problem in the U.S.-China relationship, a victory for China, so to speak. Here's how Donald Trump responded to it, and I think it validates and verifies exactly what you said in terms of Trump's posture towards China thus far.
Prime Minister Carney is in China. How do you see the deals, Canada and China? I've just signed trade deals between the two partners.
Well, that's okay. That's what he should be doing. I mean, it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that.
So, I mean, that's a departure in many respects from how U.S. presidents generally talk about China's ability to forge stronger trading relationships with neighbors or even just any country that's not the United States. What do you make of this? How do you see this changing anything at all with the U.S.-China relationship? And Also, how does this fit into now where we're going as we close up here soon? The overall picture when we look at the world situation right now, how does this kind of development, European countries, Canada, moving more towards possibly China because of the way that the Trump administration is treating issues like Greenland, for example?
For whatever reason, people in Canada believe that Carney and Trump hate each other. Carney is his great rival to Trump. But guys, let's go into some history, okay? Mark Carney used to work for Goldman Sachs in New York. So we can imagine that he knew Trump, or they were socializing in the same circles. That Mark Carney then went on to become governor of the Bank of Canada, and then the first foreign governor of the Bank of England. Okay, and then he became a vice chair of Brookfield. What is Brookfield? Well, Brookfield are the people in 2018 who basically bailed out Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner had this white elephant property called 666 Fifth Avenue in New York City. It was costing him a lot of money. He was about to go bankrupt. Then Brookfield came in and saved his ass. Okay, and people argue it was to curry favor with Trump. Mark Carney has never been elected to any office before he became Prime Minister of Canada. And during the leadership race, when Justin Trudeau resigned, basically all the other candidates faded away and gave the nomination to Mark Carney. Everyone expected Pierre Poilievre, who is the leader of the Conservatives, to triumph in the election, because after 10 years of Trudeau, everyone was just sick of the Liberals. They were sick of Liberal policy, and there were many who believed that Carney was actually the real mastermind, the puppet master behind Trudeau, and that's what explained the housing problem and the immigration problem in Canada. But then what Trump did was just threaten Canada and says, we're going to make you into the 51st state. And Pierre Poilievre, he's basically imploded. He just basically went away, and they gave the election to Mark Carney. And then Trump called Mark Carney to congratulate him. And people, for whatever reason, Canadians are probably among the most stupid people in the world. They actually believe that Carney is working for Canadians. He doesn't work for Canada. He has never worked for Canada. He works for the city of London. He works for Wall Street. And right now, this transnational capital are aligned in their interest, which is to open up the China market for international finance. Again, the last store of wealth in the world that is untapped are the Chinese household savings. Every other Western nation is overstretched. Like Canadians have maxed out their credit cards. Canadian household debt is over 100% of their income. Okay, so like these people in the West are just bankrupt. Okay, the Chinese still have savings. So what do? You open up the China market and you allow Chinese to buy real estate in Canada. You allow them to send their kids overseas to study in Canada. You allow them to buy Canadian dollars. Okay, so that's the grand plan in motion. And Carney is just is just one of these agents that want to open up China. Okay, so that's the game plan here. And the idea that Carney actually represents Canada, he doesn't care. All his money is the United States, man. His company is an American company, essentially, right? So the idea that any of these leaders in the West, they represent the people, it's just complete nonsense.
Yeah, it's certainly the model, and it's what you just described with Canada is copying the American model, financialization, indebtedness, turning your economy into a Ponzi scheme, decimating industry, and then with China, which has a massive industry, massive technology, and then of course this massive, a massive quote unquote middle class with lots and lots of money in their pockets. Now it seems like there's a big conflict between, do we try to talk them into going along with our program, or do we want to try to topple them so they go along with our program? I think that's the big dilemma facing especially the U.S. empire. I find Canada and all these other countries in the West to just they're vassals, in my opinion. Exactly. Even if they deviate temporarily because of Trump's approach at a given moment, it'll be the same at the end of the day, right?
How stupid Canadians are. Like you have Canadian conservatives on social media saying like, oh my God, we are now hugging the dragon. We're calling surrendering our sovereignty to China. Oh my God. You guys not know what's going on? Canada has never been a sovereign nation. It's never been sovereign. It's never been a democracy. It is a resource colony of the Anglo-American Empire. It's a vassal state. Right now, Canada has become a toxic asset because of inflated housing prices that have destroyed the Canadian economy. The entire Canadian economy is based on money laundering, by the way. So now that it's a toxic asset, what do? Well, as a banker, right? Mark Carney is a banker. You dump it off to foreign investors. That's what you do. That's the entire game plan, guys.
Yeah, last time I checked, Canada is still in NAFTA, which means it is still very much an economic vassal of the United States, as you said, a resource.
80% of Canadian trade with the United States, man. Come on, man.
Yeah. We have one audience question, Professor Zhang, that definitely want to ask you. This is a very generous donation here. As the professor of China, Europe, Japan would dump U.S. treatment treasuries. What's your opinion on this?
Okay. So I know this is going to sound counterintuitive, okay? But the U.S. Treasury is a trap for these nations, okay? So there's a popular saying in finance. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $500 billion, the bank you own the bank, okay? So U.S. Treasuries, don't perceive it as, America owing money to Europe, Japan, and China. It's really, Europe, China, and Japan paying a bribe to America in order to maintain global peace and global trade, okay? So the idea that they would dump the treasuries is nonsense because one, who would buy these stupid things, okay? I mean, like no one's gonna buy $500 billion of U.S. treasuries. That's number one. Number two is that this is actually a declaration of war because you are now attacking the U.S. dollar, which is a source of American power. So what the American empire is going to do is come attack you to teach you a lesson and teach the world a lesson. And number three, and this is the most important, is that there's actually no viable alternative to the US dollar at this point. If you want to engage in global trade, and China, Japan, and Europe need to engage in global trade, then you need the US dollar. It's the most liquid, it's the most universally accepted, it's the most transparent. Unfortunately, that's the case.
Yeah, and we do see movement away from U.S. treasuries. China, I believe, major dumping going on over a matter of many years.
The concern,
but it's still no. I was just going to say, but it's still a slow process that takes lots of time and probably needs major shifts beyond this.
The concern is that Europe, Japan, and China are no longer buying as much U.S. dollars as they used to, right? And because it's a Ponzi scheme, this threatens the entire Ponzi scheme. And then that's why America is behaving the way it is, because it's trying to force Europe, Japan, and China to buy more U.S. dollars, okay? So it's trying to open up the Chinese market and soak up all these household savings. It's trying to get Japan to remilitarize, to force Japan to save its excess savings on U.S. weapons, okay? So that's a game plan. It's really simple, okay? So Carney's a banker, and Trump is a mafia boss, and this is how they behave, and this is how they think.
Right. Well, Professor John, we're gonna have to see whether they will get the return on their investments that they hope for, because as we've been talking,
it's gonna blow in their face.
Yeah, exactly. Because as we've been talking about,
I'm saying this is what they're planning, and this is what they want.
Yeah, exactly. Because this world is changing so dramatically, and I think that's what's causing so much of this tension too. The more that the world changes, the more that we enter a period of especially U.S. empire in decline. The more that accelerates, the more tense and tight and absolutely desperate it all becomes.
最近网上爆火的江学勤教授2024年的3大预测，前2个预测从现在来看呢，已经非常的准确。那么江教授的第3大预测是美国和以色列对伊朗的打击是必败的。目前主流的地缘政治专家都是持这个观点的。所以第3个预测的准确性呢，应该还是挺高的。接下来我们来看看对伊朗打击前的1个月，江学勤教授在线上节目再度对伊朗局势进行预测，可以说是句句命中。美国3大武器宣传炸弹美金，特别是美国靠美金所做的一些活动，比如从伊拉克进攻伊朗的库尔德武装。3月4日晚，以色列第12频道耶路撒冷邮报援引美国官员的消息，称数千库尔德武装从伊拉克北部越境来进攻伊朗。3月5日，美以官员再次证实地面进攻已经开始。不得不说这段预测确实让人佩服。美国和以色列打 打击伊朗的原因呢，我们之前很多视频都分析过了，江学勤教授也深度分析了，大家可以自行观看。接下来我们来聊一聊伊朗战争的走势。美国今天面对的伊朗呢，已经不是20年前的伊朗了。伊朗的导弹工业、无人机体系，比如大家熟知的空中小摩托，以及区域代理网络，都已经形成了完整的非对称的作战体系。美国如果还想像当年打击伊拉克那样迅速的去解决战斗，几乎是不可能的。一旦战争扩大，整个中东都将会被卷入战争。霍尔木兹海峡、红海航道、苏伊士运河、波斯湾的能源运输都将受到冲击。这意味着什么？这意味着战争的代价将会迅速的溢出中东，冲击全球经济。更为关键的一点是，美国今天的战争资源其实已经非常的有限，俄乌战争还在消耗欧洲的安全体系，美国需要维持北约。亚太方向，美国还在构建对华战略的围堵，现在再在中东打一场高强度的战争，本身就已经接近战略透支了。所以从长期来看，美国和以色列很难真正赢得这场战争。军事上或许可以取得局部的战果，比如摧毁部分的设施，打击部分目标，但是要改变伊朗这个国家的政权几乎是不可能的。伊朗是一个拥有9000多万人口的大国，地形呢也非常复杂，民族凝聚力非常的强。一旦进入全面的战争状态，美国很难承受长期消耗。很多人忽略了一个更为重要的变量，那就是中国。中国不会直接来介入这场战争，但中国绝对不会坐视伊朗被彻底的击垮。原因很简单，伊朗是中国在欧亚大陆战略布局中的关键节点，从一带一路到能源安全，伊朗都具有非常重要的地缘位置。如果伊朗政权被颠覆，中东将完全落入美国控制之下，这对中国来说是完全不可接受的。大家都知道，中国对伊朗的支持呢，肯定不会直接的军事介入，但是我们在能源的贸易、稳定伊朗经济、加强与伊朗的技术与工业合作方面，在国际外交为伊朗争取空间等方面，绝对会提供最大的支持。同时中国与俄罗斯之间也可能在战略上形成某种默契，使伊朗不至于被完全的孤立。换句话说，美国面对的其实不是一个孤立的伊朗，而是一个背后有欧亚大陆力量支撑的伊朗。从历史经验来看美国在中东的战争几乎都有一个共同的结局：战术胜利，战略失败。无论是伊拉克、阿富汗都是如此。如果美国再次陷入伊朗战争，很可能重复同样的结果。战争会拖长，美国财政压力会扩大，国内政治撕裂会加剧，而全球力量格局也会继续向多极化的方向去倾斜。用一句话来总结伊朗战争美国以色列必败的原因那就是如果美国要取得对伊朗战争的胜利那么就必须将资源全部倾斜至中东，在亚太方向将再也无力面对中国崛起，这可关乎到美国的未来因此美国绝对不会陷入伊朗战争。后续我认为美国绝对会在一个合适的窗口期抽身伊朗战争，或者与伊朗和谈，将战略重心重新拉回亚太。我是烽火，没点订阅的朋友点个订阅吧，我们下期再继续聊。